This looks like a prolonged fight at the moment, and because it's a prolonged war, the immediate effect is being faced by global economies. Global oil prices rose once again today. They've almost hit their highest level in the last 10 years. In India, remember, the Narendra Modi government has hiked petrol and diesel prices twice this week, and today CNG prices were also hiked. The opposition is alleging that the centre held back prices for the last 4 months because of the elections. The BJP insists that it's the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war and soaring crude oil prices that are responsible for the price hike. In a moment, that's going to be my political focus. But first, take a look at the macro picture as the oil and be prepared for an oil shock.
March 21, 2022. Petrol and diesel prices hiked by 80 paisa per litre. March 22, 2022. Petrol and diesel prices hiked by 80 paisa per litre for the second consecutive day. March 22, 2022. Domestic cooking gas price hiked by 50 rupees per cylinder. March 24, 2022. Piped natural gas price hiked by 1 rupee and compressed natural price hiked by 50 paise in Delhi and National Capital Region. Back-to-back blow to the Aam Aadmi that ended more than 4 months of price freeze that coincided with assembly elections in 5 states.
महंगाई है, अब जो है मजदूरी वही है, तो अगर मजदूरी तेल पे 10 रुपए बढ़ रहे हैं तो पब्लिक पे ही पड़ रहा है। इस बात का असर तो सरकार देखे इस बात को।
सीएनजी रेट तो बढ़ गया, लेकिन मेरा किराया तो नहीं बढ़ रहा है ना। किराया तो वही कोई है, मजदूरी तो कोई बढ़ नहीं रही है। गवर्नमेंट को चाहिए ये भी ध्यान दे कि मजदूरी बढ़ाए।
हर चीज में इतनी महंगाई बढ़ रही है, यूक्रेन और उसमें रूस में युद्ध हो रहा है, तो इससे क्या मतलब है, इतनी महंगाई क्यों बढ़ रही है हर चीज में?
The opposition is up in arms, holding protests across the country against the fuel and LPG price hike. The TRS in Telangana on Thursday organized protests across the state. NCP workers also hit the streets against the Modi government. In Goa, Congress MLAs held a march against the price hike. Both houses of parliament witnessed opposition protests and ruckus this week. Opposition MPs demanded a discussion on fuel price hike in Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha.
उनका एजेंडा है एक के बाद एक आइटम्स के ऊपर प्राइसेस बढ़ाते जाना, कभी 80 पैसे, कभी 40 पैसे, कभी 1 रुपया। ये ऐसा बढ़ा कर लोगों को तंग और तबाह कर रहे हैं और गरीब लोगों की जिंदगी से वो खेल रहे हैं।
ये सरकार का रवैया दिखाता है कि इतनी अहंकार से भरी है कि महंगाई चरम सीमा पर है, जनता की पॉकेट पे वैसे ही मार है, बेरोजगारी बढ़ती जा रही है और आप लोग उन पे और चोट लगाए जा रहे हो। तो हर चीज आप अपने पॉलिटिकल एम्स के हिसाब से कर रहे हैं, जनता की आप सोच ही नहीं रहे हैं।
The Narendra Modi government has defended the hike, citing the Russia-Ukraine war.
महंगाई बढ़ी हुई है, इससे हमने कभी नहीं कहा कि महंगाई नहीं बढ़ी हुई। हम उनकी तरह जो है कुतर्क नहीं करते, लेकिन महंगाई क्यों बढ़ी है? आज पूरी दुनिया रूस और यूक्रेन का जो युद्ध चल रहा है उससे प्रभावित हुई है। आज जो है पूरी दुनिया में का बाजार जो है वो बेहाल है।
Global crude oil prices have been on the boil since the Russia invasion of Ukraine. Prices have surged from $70 per barrel on December 2nd to $121 on March 23rd, a 73% jump to almost the highest level in nearly a decade. The challenge for the Modi government would be to insulate India as much as possible from the oil shock that is bound to worsen further. Bureau Report, India Today.
So how should India navigate a potential oil shock? Joining me now first, Vikram Mehta, Chairman, Distinguished Fellow, Center for Social and Economic Progress, also been former chairperson at Shell India, so knows a thing or two about oil. Direct question, Mr. Mehta, how should India navigate the oil crisis as prices continue to rise globally?
There is no silver bullet answer to that question. we have to put it in the proper context. First is there's a known reality, and that is the prices of oil will be volatile. What is unknown is whether the volatility will be upwards or downwards, whether the trajectory of oil price will be rising or declining. The fundamentals of the oil market, of course, rest on supply and demand and geopolitics, but there is a new dimension to oil politics or oil prices, and that is the psychology of the individual leaders that control the levers of energy policy in countries that are major producers of oil and gas. So against that backdrop, we have to take certain decisions now for the short term and also position ourselves for the medium and long term. The decision for the short term would be to take steps to enhance our strategic reserves so that we are better prepared for the unexpected. We also need to shift our focus from oil to gas. There are multiple sources of gas, whereas today we are overly dependent on the Middle East for oil imports. But in the medium term and long term, we have to recognize that we are particularly vulnerable to the geopolitics of fossil fuels and the emergent geopolitics of clean fuels. And as we transit from the fossil fuel economy to a clean fuel economy, we will have to take steps to navigate these two geopolitics. The geopolitics of fossil fuels is kind of known to us. It rests very much on the politics of countries like in the Middle East and what we are seeing in Russia. But the geopolitics of new energy rests on China and many of the acolytes of China, countries that have control or a chokehold over rare minerals and components that are essential for effecting the transition from fossil fuels to the new energy market.
You're in a sense, Mr. Mehta, giving us the macro picture, both short term and long term. But I want to, for a moment, focus on the short term because a month into the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, energy and food prices soaring, creating macro uncertainty, global inflation up. In a situation like that, what should the government do? Can it in any way insulate the consumer, given that oil marketing companies didn't raise prices for 137 days because of the election? Now no elections. Will the pressure be there on them to hike up prices? Is there any way that you believe governments can insulate the consumer from potential oil shock?
The government can insulate the consumer, but at the cost of undermining or potentially even destroying the finances of their public sector oil companies. They sought to insulate the consumer in 2008, and that led to the ratcheting up of debt of Indian Oil, HPCL and BPCL, to the extent that many of the investment programs of these companies had to be suspended. It would be a mistake to repeat that. So the decision today should be to raise the price of oil, to the retail price of oil, or at least to make sure that the government does not subsidize the consumer totally against the volatility, the upward volatility of international prices. Now, that's a challenge, political challenge, but the governments in the past have taken, have adopted a sensible way of approaching that challenge, which is to raise the price incrementally, step by step. And that is probably what this government is currently planning to do.
But where does that leave the customs and duty and tax structures which many believe are being used by the government to shore up their revenues?
Well, that's an old story, and I guess we can't escape from that. The fiscal pressures on the government are immense, and the oil economy does provide a very major bulwark to support that fiscal sort of situation. But yes, if the government really wanted to protect the consumer, they will have to take a hit on their fiscal balance sheet or fiscal sort of bottom line by reducing the taxes.
So you wouldn't advise that, would you? Are you someone who's pushing for petroleum products to be brought under GST?
I'm very strongly pushing for that. I think the gas and oil should be brought under GST. I think the rates should be streamlined. I also, as I said just now, believe that the consumer should not be subsidized to the extent that the government has subsidized them so far. it's very important that the oil companies are able to actually plan for the medium and long term, which they will not be able to do if their balance sheet is totally eroded.
A final question, therefore. We are importing 85% of our oil needs, making us the world's third biggest oil importer and consumer. You said that in the medium term, we need to discover alternative sources of fuel, fossil fuel. We need to move beyond this complete dependence on oil. Do you see that happening?
Well, there will be a transition, of course, from fossil fuels to non-fossil fuels. But even as and when countries and India reaches net zero, the oil and gas economy will still be a very important part of our economic system. So that's one very hard truth that we better accept. So in that sort of situation, we must recognize that we need to continue to harness our indigenous reserves of oil and gas. We need to make sure that we develop long-term relations with countries that are strong on production. And one trend that we are going to see in coming years is that there's going to be a concentration of global production. More and more countries are going to fall off the sort of export ladder, and a few countries like Saudi Arabia will have a predominant chokehold over the oil and gas export market. So we need to develop long-term relationships with those countries, and we need to actually concentrate a lot more on gas. We need to build up gas infrastructure and perhaps even revive conversations with Turkmenistan and Iran. It's a long shot to develop a transnational gas pipeline.
Okay. Vikram Mehta, thanks very much for joining us and giving us your perspective. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome, Rajdeep.
Okay, that's the expert perspective on oil prices.